137,000 digital images. By superimposing them in a process called mosaicing, the team built a three-dimensional puzzle of the wreck. But that was just the start.
Wherever you are, you will only ever see one piece. So you need to know roughly what that piece is. You need to know where it is in the context of all the other pieces of the jigsaw.
What side?
On the port side, just after the anchor. The remains of the starboard windlass.
Using the photographs like a roadmap of the wreckage site, investigators sent down a second submersible, equipped with a bank of lights and a high-resolution video camera. It was steered from the surface using a fiber optic umbilical cord. No easy task.
John, could you do something with the focus over there? Just go to options. Yeah.
Eventually, the camera located the bridge, the place that was home at sea for the 44 on board, the place where Peter Lambert and the others lived and died. A chilling sight.
Have a look. See the damage. Have a look at that. And then come around and have a look at that, please. Accommodation had been ripped off and was lying in a heap on the seabed. It was just an eggshell. There was nothing inside.
It was almost unrecognizable. But to the former chief officer who'd once sailed on the Derbyshire, the images were both familiar and haunting.
It was a very moving experience to look at the underwater wreckage site and think, well, that's where I used to sit and have my coffee.
Malpas was astonished at the extent of the damage, especially considering the size and strength of the Derbyshire.
This is the anchor cable and starboard windlass. It's massive in size and heavy in construction. You can see how solid it is, and it is amazing to see it has been broken off by some massive force at the bed plate level. This is the foremast, and on the underwater video evidence, it no longer exists as part of the ship. Cropped it off down at the deck level. These are the mooring bits, incredibly strong in construction, and these are no longer intact. The sheer weight of the water has either exploded them or crushed them down to pancake level.
Crushed, flattened, sheared off, but definitely not burned. If there had been a fire or explosion in the engine room, the ship would have shown the scars.
If there had been a fire or a flash fire, as an explosion can be, then you would expect to see damaged paintwork, charred, blackened. Every piece of equipment we saw in the engine room and the bulkheads we saw in the engine room, pristine.
The video proved beyond doubt. It was not a fire in the engine room that sank the Derbyshire.
The other one you can see a piece of, but this one didn't show up. It was like it's underneath the flare, I think.
Williams next focused on the strongest theory, that a defect in one of the ship's steel ribs, called frame 65, had caused it to crack in two at the surface. The fact that the bridge section lay broken away from the rest of the ship seemed to support that theory. But the position of the pieces on the ocean floor told a different story.
If, for example, the ship had broken in two, then we would have seen two separate wreckage fields, and you would have had this natural separation. But We didn't happen catastrophically like the ship breaking into at the surface.
For 10 years, Frame 65 had been the prime suspect. It was the major reason for their expedition, but the evidence they found just didn't support that theory. Williams was stumped. A rogue wave remained a possibility, but there was a problem with that theory too. If the Derbyshire was struck by a rogue wave, the bow would have been smashed to pieces like the rest of the ship. But it wasn't. It remained remarkably intact. In fact, the bow looked almost as it had on the surface, almost untouched. It had crashed into the ocean floor with such force, it had cleaved a crater 18 meters deep. Yet unlike the rest of the ship, the bow had survived the 4-kilometer plunge without being crushed by water pressure. That could mean only one thing. The bow was flooded before the ship sank.
If a compartment is already flooded, it will not implode. So if there is a break in the structure as the ship sinks, the water floods in and there's no implosion. So you would expect to see that piece on the seabed pretty well as you would see it on the surface.
Williams knew that if the bow had flooded, the Derbyshire would have been doomed. With the added weight in the bow, the waves would have pounded directly onto the cargo hatch covers. They weren't designed to withstand that kind of punishment. First, hatch cover number 1 would have buckled.
In this case, 10,000 tons could go straight into number 1 hold. Number 2 hold was empty, another 20,000 tons. And by the time you're at that position, you're sinking.
But there was one final mystery. The key to the whole disaster. What caused the bow to flood in the first place? Williams was struck by a single image, a small hatch on the front of the bow. The bosun's hatch led into a cavernous area below deck, a honeycomb of hallways and storage spaces.
We want to get a look at that thing that's just going down there, stuck on the marble column.
What he saw in the video forced Williams to consider the unthinkable.
Looking at that evidence, it looked as if it was open at the time of the loss, for whatever reason, and one of those reasons could have been crew negligence.
A fatal mistake made by one of the crew? It was the one theory that no one associated with the investigation wanted to hear, but Williams could not ignore it.
You couldn't whitewash it, you couldn't hide it, you couldn't put it to one side. You've got to tell it as it is.
Back in Liverpool, the news hit like a bombshell.
You got some of the families thinking, was my husband or my son the one responsible for not locking down the bosun's store, which caused the initiating event, which caused the loss? Could he be the one who caused the deaths of everyone on board? It was horrendous.
The possibility that the Derbyshire had been sunk by negligence was hard for the families to hear. But no matter how painful, the video evidence from the wreckage site was just too compelling for investigators to ignore.
You have to be professional and single-minded about it. You are there to seek evidence, good or bad.
But one man knew something others couldn't learn through looking at pictures. The former chief officer, who was supposed to have been on board for the Derbyshire's last fateful voyage.
It's just inconceivable to me that any of the crew from Captain Underhill down would have ever gone into conditions approaching typhoon conditions, leaving a forward hatch open.
But investigators believed they had found the fatal flaw. Not only was there thick mooring line protruding from one of the hatches, but photographs revealed a thin rope tied around a toggle that was supposed to fasten down the hatch cover. The rope could have prevented the lid from closing securely. But the investigators had it wrong. That thin rope was actually a makeshift security measure invented by the ship's crew, and Nigel Malpas was the only one alive to prove it.
When I was on the Derbyshire, this is how we used to put the heaving line around, making a cat's cradle. Heavy seas hitting this lid can cause these to unwind. This arrangement prevents any unwinding. If this lid had been blown off as the vessel was underwater and sinking, then this arrangement, of course, would be damaged and torn off. But it would leave one piece of rope hanging down on the back quarter, which is what we now see on the video evidence as she lies on the seabed.
In Liverpool, the revelation brought a huge sense of relief.
It took the blame right off, the stigma that the crew were responsible. That gave the families peace of mind. It allowed the families to sleep at night and proved that they did not cause the loss of the Derbyshire.
For Williams and his team, it was back to the drawing board. If it wasn't an open hatch, what had caused the bow to flood?
We still had to go and look at every piece of steel to ensure that all the evidence would fit the final solution. There's only one solution that explains all the evidence, and that's the right solution.
They pored over the images of the sunken bow, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Then, Williams found the answer. A series of small round holes in the deck. Ventilator holes. Less than 1/3 of a metre in diameter, there were a dozen of them in the bow of the Derbyshire. But the covers, resembling mushroom caps and used to keep the water out, were missing. It seemed insignificant, but Williams was convinced that those missing caps led to the Derbyshire's demise. Had they been just too flimsy to stand up to the pounding waves?
These vent heads are put under enormous stress, and 2 or 3 millimeters of steel isn't going to last very long.
It was the last piece of the puzzle. 17 years after she disappeared without trace, Williams finally knew what had sunk the Derbyshire. With the discovery that the ventilator caps on the bow of the Derbyshire were missing, investigators could piece together the sequence of events that led to the disaster. This is how it happened. The 8th of September, 1980. The Derbyshire and her crew of 44 were just a few days from their scheduled arrival in Japan when they were caught by Typhoon Orchid.
This typhoon was a big, heavy old lumbering beast. Big waves for a long time. And you can imagine these things beating hell out of that foredeck over 24 hours. Something had to give way.
And what gave way were the ventilator caps. Torn away by the waves, leaving a dozen open holes, each less than 30 centimeters in diameter.
You still had these big waves coming, and every time the wave passed, a slug of water went down in there. And it was like a dripping tap. It eventually fills the basin.
For 36 hours, water slowly flooded the forward storage space. The extra weight meant the ship was riding lower in the water, exposing it to the full onslaught of the waves. The flooding bow was inaccessible from below deck, and in the storm, invisible from the bridge. The captain and crew had no idea it was dragging them down.
You've been sitting in this storm for 12, 14 hours, and you've got used to the whole motion going on, and there's a slight change. It doesn't quite come up so far, doesn't rise quite so quickly. So what is it?